All right, well, if people are registering, I want to try and welcome everybody to our webinar. It's an 8 p.m. start tonight due to our guest from the United States in the east coast of the United States, and I think we're trying to fit in with your time zone, Walt. So welcome, Walt Heyer, and we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you.
I'll introduce you more formally later. And also, we have Senator Claire Chandler from Tasmania, and I'll introduce Claire in just one moment. But may I just make sure that you're all aware that it is a recorded webinar, and that webinar will be available on our YouTube channel in about a week's time. Your host tonight, of course, is myself as the National Webinar host, and David DeLever, my co-host, will be looking after you. So please feel free to email us during the night for any questions. Well, indeed, our guest tonight is Walt Heyer and, of course, Senator Claire Chandler. And the topic of transgenderism, if you like, or gender politics, as I've called it, is an issue that's really, really starting to, become very vocal from both sides of the debate. One of the issues that we've got here in Australia is that, of course, the media have been captured by the left-wing media in the sense that very little is given to the opposing view to those that want to transgender. So we've got to make sure that it is a balanced argument and a level playing field. And in that regard, I know that Senator Claire Chandler, of course, from Tasmania, has a number of particular issues. And if I may, Senator, I'll introduce you very quickly because we'd like you to be the first speaker. For those that are still logging on, please be aware that Senator Claire Chandler is not feeling the best tonight, but she will talk to us, and she may have to leave the webinar due to some medical cough and what have you, which I have as well. So we'll have to just sort of excuse Senator Chandler when that time comes. Well, if I may, please, Senator, I realise that you came to the Tasmanian Senate in 2019, and you have a very, very strong campaign on helping protect women's sport campaign. In other words, what you're trying to do is start a petition with Sports Australia to prevent biological men from competing in women's sport, which I think is a wonderful idea. Now, I also know that you chair a number of committees, including the Finance and Public Administration Legislation Committee. You're Deputy Chair of the Finance and Public Administration Reference Committee, and you're also Deputy Chair of the Select Committee on Temporary Migration. It gives me great pleasure, everybody, to introduce Senator Claire Chandler from Tasmania, who's going to talk to us about men trying to get into women's sport and why there is a campaign currently going on. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you very much to Family Voice for having me on the webinar tonight. As you can probably hear, and as Greg alluded to, I'm probably not as well spoken as I ordinarily would be. I've had a bit of a cold that has also, obviously, from my background, rendered me unable to travel to Canberra yet this week. I'm zooming into this meeting from home in Tassie, so many apologies that I'm not going to be able to make it through for too long tonight, but I will speak for as long as my voice holds out. And it's a real pleasure to speak to you all tonight about some of the issues that I've worked on since becoming a senator in the federal parliament in 2019. And that's the protection of women's sports and women's facilities and the way in which they're being undermined by radical left-wing gender theory. Unfortunately, we're at a point in Australia and in much of the rest of the world where any questioning of radical left-wing gender theory is considered completely taboo. And what do I mean when I'm talking about radical gender theory? Well, primarily for me, it's the idea that your gender identity and internal feeling is the determinant of whether you are a man or a woman, and therefore the access that you can have to single-sex facilities, services and sports, which were created specifically to cater for the differences between the two sexes. With very little public scrutiny or understanding of what was happening at the time, Australia enacted this idea in law back in 2013 under the former Labor government, when the definitions of man and woman were deleted from the Sex Discrimination Act. Now, the Sex Discrimination Act, as the name suggests, was legislated to prevent you from being discriminated against because of your biological sex. Now, that piece of legislation contains no definition of sex, man, woman, male, or female in it. And people ask, well, why does this matter? But it's because the words man and woman do have specific meanings directly related to biological sex. They mean adult males and adult females. And when we created women's sport, everyone understood that the reason it existed was because females can't compete fairly and safely against males in the vast majority of sports. And when we created men's and women's change rooms, we all understood they meant male change rooms and female change rooms. We have separate women's and men's prisons because we all understand that female prisoners would inevitably be assaulted and harassed if housed with male sex offenders. When the government or a charity establishes a shelter for women fleeing domestic violence or a sexual assault support group for women, it's perfectly obvious to any sensible person that those services are designed for females, and it'd be completely inappropriate to expect women in those situations to share those spaces with males, regardless of their gender identity. Yet today, if you suggest that these services should remain female only, you will be accused of bigotry and transphobia for daring to exclude biological males who identify as women. This is a simply absurd situation. Females haven't suddenly become athletically equal to males, and men haven't stopped getting prostate cancer, and women haven't stopped getting cervical cancer. Women haven't stopped experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault. That's why sex-specific sports, services and facilities still matter, and they always will. We need women's single-sex sport to exist if we ever want to have female Olympic champions, and if we don't want the next generation of girls to have to play their junior sport and community sport against boys with huge physical advantages over them. Once you start including males in women's sports, it's no longer single-sex sport for women. Once you start saying that biologically male sex offenders can be housed in a women's prison, well, you no longer have a safe single-sex women's prison. You've just removed women's rights when the evidence, if anybody cared to take that into account, is very clear that female-only sport and spaces are an essential part of our society. That's the trick that has been played on Australians, and particularly Australian women. Nobody's ever fronted up to a press conference and said, well, we're your elected representatives of Parliament, and we now have a policy that women can't have single-sex sport or single-sex change rooms anymore. It doesn't happen like that. Instead, they've implemented that situation by stealth, simply by changing the definition of man and woman and saying that single-sex services and sports are discriminatory. Because this has happened without public consultation or public debate, unfortunately, there are many Australians who are not aware of what has happened or the impact it's had on women's rights. And that's allowed those who push this agenda to create a number of myths around this debate, which they use to prevent media and governments looking more closely at the impacts of gender ideology. The first one, and this is the big one, is that if you question their ideology, or even if you acknowledge that there are two sexes and that there should be sex-specific sports and facilities, then you must automatically be transphobic and bigoted. In other words, if you disagree with this view, then you are committing a hate crime. It's hard to think of a more misleading, dangerous, and manipulative tactic than to claim that anyone who understands that there are two sexes is motivated in that belief by hatred or bigotry. The advocacy that I've been involved with since being elected to the Senate, particularly around women's sports, is based on a principle which until very recently would have been entirely uncontroversial, that women are entitled to single-sex sport because it's neither safe nor fair for women to play physical sports against men. That's a position which, as I said, has been entirely uncontroversial for decades. And if simple common sense isn't enough, well, I can back up my view that women shouldn't be forced to play sport against males with clear and indisputable science and data. But the activists know that they can't win this debate based on common sense, science and data. So instead, they scream transphobia and demand that there be no debate about the issues. Unfortunately, it's been a very successful tactic, which most of the media and many of those in the public service have fallen for hook, line and sinker. Now, It should go without saying that in advocating for single-sex women's sports, health services, crisis support services, or for evidence-based care for children with gender dysphoria, we have absolutely no ill will or dislike of people who identify as transgender or struggle with gender dysphoria. Unfortunately, though, we constantly see journalists and the media commentators starting from the position that any discussion of these issues is off limits because it's tantamount to hate speech. And I think that's an appalling indictment on the media's willingness to look at facts and evidence and give a fair hearing to both sides of this debate. The second myth that they've created is that it's only a small segment of society who has any issue with the recognition of biological sex being replaced by self-affirmed gender identity. When a conservative raises concerns about gender ideology, well, they'll say nobody but conservatives is against being inclusive. When a feminist raises issues about gender ideology, they say, well, nobody but radical feminists is against being inclusive. When a female athlete raises concerns about the fairness and safety of having a biological male in women's sport, then they'll say, well, none of the other women in this sport have a problem with it. And when parents raise concerns about the impact of gender ideology on their children, they say, well, you don't understand your own children, or worse, you don't even care about them. And again, the media fall for this rhetoric and treat anyone raising concerns as if they're a tiny minority trying to cause trouble who should either be ignored or pilloried. But of course, the reality is when you have feminists, conservatives, athletes, parents, doctors, teachers, psychiatrists, and everyday Australians from across the political spectrum who are all concerned about the impact of this ideology, well, you know, you're not in the minority. And it's important that despite coming from very diverse backgrounds and perspectives, the majority doesn't stay silent. Unfortunately, because of the cancel culture tactics, the social media bullying, the massive lobby groups which work behind the scenes to influence government policy and corporate behaviour, it's so difficult for anyone to speak up and have their say. In my own example, for speaking up and saying that women's rights in women's change rooms were designed for females and should remain that way, I was subject to a complaint lodged through the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commission and summons to a compulsory conciliation conference. Even since then, for the advocacy that I've undertaken, I've been sent anonymous emails full of profanity and abuse. And you only have to have the briefest look at a platform like Twitter to see that such behaviour directed at women like me who advocate for sex-based rights by members of the trans lobby is not only common, but actually celebrated by those who claim to be all about love and inclusion. Other Australian women have been fined and threatened with jail for liking Facebook posts and kicked out of volunteer associations for posting about the reality of biological sex. Anyone who believes in free speech, the reality of biological sex, women's rights, and protecting children from harmful mistruths should be concerned about radical gender theory. And regardless of which party you vote for, how old or young you are, or even which of the two sexes you are, if you are concerned about these issues, it's important you speak up now, because these dangerous ideologies become even more embedded in the system than they already are if we don't. I will certainly keep speaking up about these issues into the future. However, I'm not entirely convinced my voice is going to hold out much longer for me to continue speaking out about them tonight. So once again, thank you so much, Greg and David, for organising the Zoom session tonight. And I hope that all of your members find the discussion interesting and look forward to hearing from Walt as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. What we'll do is we'll send you any questions that come our way, and we may send them to you. It's a very topical issue you've raised, because they've heard on the news tonight that the Olympic Games have allowed the first transgender athlete to participate, which is interesting. We also have some journalists, I think, that have registered tonight. So we'll see if we get a balanced report on the issue as well the next day. Senator, thank you very much for joining us. We'll send you any questions that come your way, and we look forward to having you again down the track. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay. I'd like to introduce, if I may, Walt Heyer. Welcome. Good evening, Walt, from United States East Coast. What part of the East Coast, Walt?
North Carolina.
North Carolina. Well, I've got friends in South Carolina, so there is a relationship there. Look, may I introduce Walt very quickly so we can get to the topic? Walt Heyer was a husband, father, and a corporate executive who underwent gender reassignment surgery at the age of 42, going from man to woman. 8 years later, Walt went back to man again and has been restored to his male gender. He will talk about his regret and the tragic consequences suffered as a result of transgendering. So I think Senator Chandler gave us a good introduction. I'd like to pass over to you, Walt, to give it a practical perspective as well. Welcome to our discussion tonight, Walt.
Well, thanks for having me on. Yeah, Senator Claire Chandler did a great job of beginning this conversation. And, I, as you mentioned, identified as a female during my early 40s. I was 42 years old until I was 50 years old before I detransitioned. But during that time, to sort of weigh in on what Senator Chandler was saying, was I was in a college in California, and I got on the tennis group, and it was a woman's tennis group because I was identifying as Laura Jensen. And just so people know, I never lost a tennis match. And I was 20 years older than the people I was competing against, sometimes 22, 23 years older. They were absolutely unable to compete with me in any way, shape, or form. Most of them couldn't even return the tennis ball because it was coming so swiftly. While I was enjoying that, I did not realize the impact that I was having on them, not emotionally and psychologically, but I really, while I was there, actually ruined the women's tennis during my time there. And I actually regret that. And I realized the impact that it caused. So while I was identifying as a female, of course, I was not a female. And, I came to realize that when I began to study psychology and pharmacology and the body at UC Santa Cruz so that I could become a therapist, which I never achieved getting my license, but I did get my certificate in counseling, which I started doing and have been doing for many years. So I come to speak on this issue from starting at the age of 4 years old. So I would be identified today as a 4-year-old trans kid. And here I am at 80 years old. So I'm coming with 76 years of experience. So it's not something I'm coming and bringing to the table here because of something I read or something I heard. I've been dealing with this on a personal level for 76 years. And further, my website, sexchangeregret.com, which I started about 12 years ago because I was wondering, gee, are there people who regret going through this? I know that I came to realize that you're only a transgender until you don't identify as one anymore. And so, when I stopped identifying as a transgender and reclaimed who I really was as a male biologically, I came to the conclusion that when the sperm hits the egg, that is the end of the game. Your gender sex is fixed and innate and unchangeable from the time the sperm hits the egg. And here we are, a lot of people are trying to say that that doesn't happen, but biologically and scientifically speaking, it's fixed and unchangeable from the point of that sperm hitting the egg. So we're having a discussion about trying to change something that the sperm and the egg is set in motion scientifically, biologically, and medically speaking. People taking hormones like I did or undergoing surgery, as a court document that I have on record, the surgeon who performed my surgery and one of the authors of the standards of care for transgender care signed off on in Superior Court of California, acknowledge in that document to the court that you cannot change a male into a female, no matter how much surgery, no matter how much hormones. The only thing that they acknowledged was that you can neuter. They use the word neuter. However, your intermorphology never changes. And what we know today from research is that there are 6,500 unique genes that differ between male and female. And in those genes are unchangeable, just like when the sperm hit the egg, those things are fixed and unchangeable. So why are we talking about this, or what is the discussion around? Well, because I can go way back to when I was a teenager, cross-dressing. The term that they used, they didn't have transgenders back in those days. The word transgender did not exist. It was transvestite. And so transvestite was the word for guys who dressed up in girls' clothing. So they realized, the advocates who were pushing this ideology realized that they needed a different term. They needed something that sounded more appropriate, something that sounded like they actually accomplished something. So they came up with this word. Dr. Harry Benjamin, some others did too, but Benjamin kind of acknowledged this as a transsexual was kind of the first term they used, which meant that you underwent surgery and hormones. And now this blanket term of transgender. The word transgender makes it sound like to the listener that someone has transitioned from one gender to the other. The word is actually false. It's used to make people believe that the individual has changed from one gender to the other. But we know from the Superior Court document in California that doesn't happen. So if we're to be real about it, and it's not to be harsh, keep in mind, people will say, well, Walt says. No, Walt's not saying this. The doctor who performed over 4,500 of these surgeries says at no time did he ever accomplish changing a man into a woman or a woman into a man. So it's the doctor who performed the surgery. His name was Dr. Stanley Biber, very famous, well-known Trinidad, Colorado doctor. They called it the sex change capital of the world. Dr. Stanley Biber has his name on the document in court that says you can't do it. So don't come across and say Walt said. No, Walt didn't say, the doctor said. And Dr. Paul Walker, who was the author of the International Standards of Care, WPATH, that's the standards they use today, was the original author, drafted those standards in San Diego, California during 1978, 1979, along with other doctors, was my therapist. The guy who drafted the WPATH standards that are in place today was my therapist. And he said that, I needed hormone therapy and to resolve issues from my childhood, and that I needed to undergo sex change surgery. And I followed his protocols. The author of the WPATH Standards of Care, the world-renowned Dr. Paul Walker. Well, he was wrong, and the standards were wrong, and the process is wrong. And today, because of my website, I have over 9,000 emails in my inbox, and I've worked with literally thousands of people who regret going through this. So this idea that only a small portion of people regret it is false. The reason why the number is low that they use is only like 1% or 2%, whatever number they use, is because they only count the people who detransition if they have a phalloplasty reinstalled. In other words, if they reconstruct the penis that was removed from them during surgery, then they are counted among the regretters. However, 99.9% of the people who regret having gone through this do not have a phalloplasty because it doesn't function. It's like a decoration. It's non-functional. You can't reconstruct the penis once you regret it. So they just forget it and go down the road and stop taking the female hormones and do what we call detransition, which I did over 30 years ago. And there literally thousands of people have followed in my footsteps and contact me pretty much every week, sometimes almost every day. So we know that the truth is that these are men who dress up as women, who cannot hormonally or surgically change from male to female. It doesn't happen. They're still male. They can suppress their male hormones, but they can only neuter who they are. They cannot change their inner morphology. It's important to know that not one person, according to Dr. Biber, who does the surgeries, ever biologically changes from male to female, and the same is true for the female to male. You can make a male look like he's a female, but he can't become a female. So this is why Claire's talking about this issue with men being in sports and the guy from New Zealand being able to lift all that weight. You know, it's actually pretty absurd. And if they're going to do this and allow these people who identify, and I think that's important, they identify as transgender, which actually, in my view, means that they're actually not women, they're transgender. So perhaps we need a class in sports that just says it's just for transgenders, people who go through these procedures, and let them compete against one another and see how good they are within their own category, if that's their ilk, because we know that they're actually not females at all. They don't look like females, and they obviously are much stronger. And that I proved when I was doing tennis and just eviscerated the competition. So people write to me, and one of the first things they write when they regret is, I realize now that I couldn't become a woman. And that the hormones didn't change me, the surgery didn't change me. So we have this position where I'm working with the people who regret it. So much of what I do comes from the backside. What we hear in the media are the people talking about the people as I was. Keep in mind, I was an advocate for this when I started. I was going to school so that I could help other people find their way into transition until I got into university, began to study psychology and pharmacology. And I actually worked in clinics, psychological clinics, lockdown psych units. I have extensive hours in that area. And what I realized was that these people are suffering from a variety of comorbidities. And many of the men who identify as transgender, which I've found adult men, are actually suffering from a condition we call autogynephilia. And autogynephilia is where they dress up in women's clothing, they look in the mirror, and they become the object of their own affection. They're aroused by themselves dressed as women. In my view, that's something entirely different than what they're identifying as. And it certainly bodes well for them to identify as a transgender when they're not, because they get all this high profile press. And then there's the people who have a sexual fetish disorder, and that particular group of people will be sexually aroused by a piece of clothing, whether it's lingerie or regardless whether it's shoes, whatever it is. Each one of them will have a different factor of arousal. These are sexual fetish disorders. Autogynephilia, transvestic fetish disorders are actually disorders. I'm not being harsh when I say that. That's what the medical journals say. Walt's not saying that. The medical journals say that. And so, and then we have the flamboyant individuals who are primarily homosexual, who are what we call drag queens. That's another category. They are the ones who are most often female impersonators. Many of them don't have bottom surgery. They do the top surgery. They go through other feminizing features, and they have very long eyelashes, and they just look really wild. So these are the drag queens. Many of them won't have bottom surgery. So we have that group. We have the Vestite, who is just a man dressing as a woman, calling themselves transgender when they haven't transitioned from anything. And many of the people today, by the way, who call themselves transgender haven't had any hormones and haven't had any surgery and haven't altered themselves at all. They're just men who say, I'm a woman. And I think most of us, if we have a reasonable amount of gray matter that we can apply to this, anyone who just says that they're a different gender, we need to sit down and talk with them about where are they getting this idea? Why do they think they're different than who they are? Obviously, they're probably suffering from some dissociative disorder or bipolar disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder or body dysmorphia. And there's many, schizophrenia is also one of the things that's been categorized as people who identify as transgender. So one of the things that's unfortunate, I think, is that we have the gender clinics quickly will diagnose somebody with gender dysphoria who actually don't have gender dysphoria. They're drag queen or they're autogynephilia, transvestic fetish, or they're just a cross-dresser transvestite. But it's just so politically powerful to say somebody has gender dysphoria when they don't, because it sort of leaves you breathless in terms of being able to argue any other case. That's why I bring up these other issues. And so they want to stop anyone from saying anything, but I think we're doing a great deal of harm when we don't address their specific comorbidity and say, this is what you're actually suffering from. And I can tell you that the people that I've worked with, literally hundreds and hundreds of people I work with, every last one of them can tell me what caused them to identify as a transgender. And the variations and the reasons and the things that have happened are all of them were fixable without ever taking any hormones or having any surgery. I had a young boy who at 15 years old, his parents, because he had been looking online and going into chat rooms with other boys who identified as transgender to his parents at 15 years old. And his parents helped him get hormone blockers. They helped him through that process till he was 18. His name is Nathaniel. I wrote about it in the Daily Signal. And Nathaniel then, with his parents guiding him into the clinic, had his genitals removed, reconstructed pseudo vagina, breasts put in. He began to identify as a female. And he contacted me when he was 19, almost to the day 1 year after surgery, saying, Walt, can you help me detransition? I feel like a Frankenstein monster. This was a horrible mistake. How do I fix my life? So these are the stories that the media doesn't talk about. I have literally hundreds of those. And my book, Trans Life Survivors, which you can get in Australia, has just 30 of them. I could have put 300 in that book, but I just chose to put 30. We just don't talk enough about the consequences of not addressing the underlying comorbidities. We really are failing this group of people who, many of them are really suffering, but they're not suffering from gender dysphoria. They're suffering from some other underlying comorbidity. And for some reason, it's become politically incorrect to sit down and talk to the individual and find out what's causing them to not like who they are, to where when we now work with the people and they reach back to me, we have this discussion, what we realize is that you can't become a female, then what's really happening? This now we identify as self-destructive behavior, because the only thing that you can accomplish is erasing who you are in an attempt to try to become someone who you can never be biologically. You're going to remain a biological man. So reasonable people can have a discussion about this. And reasonable people, if they sit down and understand the only thing you can accomplish is the total destruction of the male body or female who has a phalloplasty attached um, to her body. And so the destruction starts with the hormone therapy, because then you begin to permanently alter the body. And then the next part of the self-destructive behavior involves cutting and slicing off body parts, adding breast. If we're to look at this, we really should be talking about this in terms of a Frankenstein type uh, situation. And that word came up, by the way, from Nathaniel when he contacted me at age 18 after 1 year. He says, I feel like a Frankenstein monster. They ruined my life. And it was the first time I kind of thought about the Frankenstein idea. And here's it comes from an 18-year-old who started at age 15 on hormones and had the surgery, is calling it, now I'm a Frankenstein monster. Referring to what the surgeons are doing is so barbaric and so destructive that the only thing we can relate to is Dr. Frankenstein. Again, not my words. This came from Nathaniel. You can see the article in the Daily Signal. So I think we're doing irreparable harm to this population by not sitting down with them and talking with them. And that's the beauty of the work that I have been doing now for a dozen years, is I actually will sit down and talk to them. And once they have the regret sets in and they're not any longer thinking that they became a woman, they want to look deeper and find out what caused them to go through these procedures. They become very open, they become very rational, and they actually begin to get their life back and realize that when that egg hit the sperm hit the egg, that was fixed. And all the rest of the stuff was a bit of folly, surgical and hormonal folly, and lives are being ruined. And we know from Sweden, who keeps the most accurate records in the world on the medical issues of people who go through this. Sweden's own study says that if you go through this procedure, Sweden, Walt's not saying this, Sweden's saying this, you are 19 times more likely to commit suicide. So if we're pushing this transgender ideology, you end up with somebody like Nathaniel, who says, I'm a Frankenstein monster, I want my life back. Or you're going to be 19 times more likely to commit suicide, according to Sweden. And according to the doctor who did over 4,500 surgeries, not one of them actually ever changed a man into a woman. So then we have to stop and ask ourselves, what in the world are we doing? Yep. Lying to these people and telling them that they can change. The guy, the weightlifter, is a man, no matter what he's done with his hormones. Unfortunately, we're lying to the population of all our countries. We're passing laws that are actually lifting up people who are nothing more than cross-dressers, autogynephiliacs, drag queens. They have sexual fetish issues. And it's not to be harsh. These are just facts. These are just what we're dealing with. And we stop putting everybody under this umbrella of transgender that suggests that somebody changed from one gender to the other, when in fact, we know biologically, medically, scientifically, hormonally, nothing really changed.
Okay.
So that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walt. That is a great dovetails into Senator Chandler's talk. David's going to ask some questions, but just before he does, in my own chaplaincy work, Walt, I come across people who are transgender or say they are, and they keep telling me that I was born that way, that I was born to be a transgender. Scientific evidence shows that's not the case, because there's no such thing as a gay gene. Can you comment on that for me, please?
Yeah, I'd love to comment on that. I think there's two things that we need to have a discussion about here. Over 90% of the thousands of people that I've interacted with, whether it's been through email or like we're doing on the internet, over 90% of them aren't homosexual. Identifying as a transgender is not a homosexual issue.
Agreed.
And so I think we need to understand that I was not. These are people that don't deal with same-sex attraction. And they are biologically male who still want to have a relationship with another female. And so they're, however, the people who identify as drag queen are the homosexual group. So I just want to make that clarification.
Yep. Agreed. Okay.
And the rest of your question, I've forgotten.
I just there's no such thing as a gene. You're either born
Right.
male or female. It's not a gay gene, so to speak.
Right. I have. I wrote my blog. I don't know, 5 years ago now. 4 universities. I think Italy, Japan. I forget. They all concluded. And I remember the quote says, "There's not a smidgen of evidence that anyone is ever has any transgender gene, anything that would make them gay or transgender." And that the Stockholm Brain Institute, as an example, studied this, and they also said there is no transgender brain. And I think what people use these terms to sort of stifle your speech. It's not because it's factually correct. They just want to say, well, I was born that way. And the problem with that is that they actually believe it. And then I've challenged people who told me, well, I have a female brain. I said, okay, well, let's get a brain test. Well, I don't want to do that because I could prove that they don't have a female brain. But they're actually encouraged to tell people that they were born that way and that they have a female brain just to shut people up so that the argument stops. They weren't born transgender. It is in many cases, a childhood developmental issue out of the environment they're in, or from things that they read, or from the internet. They were given, just like I was. My grandmother put me in a dress when I was 4 years old and planted this little seed. She made me this purple chiffon dress, told me how cute I was. And at that point, that affirmation that she continued to do for 2.5 years, what I realized today, that when grandma put me in that purple dress, what she was really saying, and I think this is so instructive in this conversation today, what she was really saying to me when in that purple dress is, Walt, there's something wrong with you as a boy, and the only way that you can be acceptable and affirmed is if you're a female. And so she told me how cute I was, how wonderful I was, but she actually refused to acknowledge the boy that I was. She just, for whatever reason, she's since passed away, so I never had that conversation about why. But what I realized today is that when you tell a young boy how cute he looks, then you are causing childhood abuse that is psychological and emotional, and sometimes it ends up being sexual. So when I say that, because in my family, it became known that I was wearing this purple dress. I had a teenage uncle who was a little bit off center mentally. And when I was about 8 or 9 years old, he began to sexually molest me because I had been wearing that purple dress. So I think it's important to understand that had grandma not put me in that purple dress, she would not have been causing me discomfort about being a boy, because what she was telling me, telegraphing to me is, boy, Walt, there's something wrong with you, boy. You're much better as a girl. You look great in that purple dress. And that became the impetus for my uncle sexually molesting me. So these are things that just sort of track with this whole thing when people go through this process. It's harmful, it's destructive, and I can tell you from what the doctor said, I never became a woman. Surgery and hormones can't do it. Never could, never will.
Thank you, Walt. Now we've got a lot of questions. David, let's kick it off.
Yes, thanks, Greg. And Walt, thank you so much for that most instructive presentation. Question, the people that you're helping, is there a typical set of background characteristics?
Yes, there's different groups, but I would say primarily there's around 40 to 50% will have been had childhood sexual issues. Either they were molested, they were introduced to pornography. There was just something that was instructed to them as a young person about their sexuality that caused them to question who they are. Then there's the other group. Many of them, just like myself, were cross-dressed by a grandma or by their parents, or many, kind of funny, but sometimes they were cross-dressed by an older sibling. If they're a young boy and their sister is 8 or 10 years older, they would dress the boy up as a girl and tell him how cute he was. And this is also one of the factors. Then the other issues that we see primarily are families that are broken apart, where maybe there was a horrible divorce, there was a suicide in the family, maybe the child was passed around to foster homes several times. They didn't have a stable childhood that allowed the father to be in their life in a way that helped them develop the idea of what being a man or what being a girl was. And I can tell you that some of the people who write to me about being sexually abused have disclosed to me that they wanted to get rid of a boy being sexually abused at a young age. They wanted to rid themselves of their genitalia, not because they wanted to become a girl, but because in their mind as a young child, if I got rid of my genitalia, then no one would want to touch me there anymore. So they saw it as a way to protect themselves. Removing their genitalia was a way of protecting themselves from being sexually touched and abused. Girls, on the other hand, wanted to identify as a boy as a way to become unattractive to sexual predators who otherwise had been harming them and abusing them. So many times this has nothing to do with changing genders. It has to do with not trying to protect themselves against further sexual abuse.
And did you receive any counseling before your surgery or any kind of warning?
Yeah, well, Dr. Paul Walker, as I mentioned, who was the author of the WPATH Standards of Care, I was in his counsel all the way up until just 2 months before the surgery. And then after I had the surgery, continued counsel with him. He, even after the 2-year process of taking hormones, reapproved me just 2 or 3 months before the surgery. So I was in counseling with Dr. Walker that period of time.
And were you warned in any way?
Warned? They don't warn anybody. You know, this is all about affirming. You know, this we're in the same position today where you're not really allowed to talk about the consequences or the regret levels or the fact that you're 19 times more likely to commit suicide. These things are not politically acceptable language, and in many cases are considered hate speech. It's really unfortunate that giving people warnings is considered hate speech.
Well, that's incredible, because with any ordinary medical or surgical intervention, the doctors are usually falling over themselves backwards to make sure that you understand all the risks and all the possible harms.
Yeah, well, this is not normal medical stuff. This is advocacy. This is a political powerhouse. And many of the gender clinics are getting paid millions of dollars to perform these surgeries. So follow the money.
Have any of your people that you've spoken with in your book or otherwise, has anyone ever taken any legal action against a clinic or a doctor or that you're aware of?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and they've been successful. The records, however, are always sealed. That's one of the things that's most interesting, is that the records get sealed, and this has to do with you know, how much money they're willing to pay out to silence people.
There you go. Thank you, Walt. David?
Yes, Greg. Another question. Walt, could you comment further on the role of fathers to affirm biological gender on the one hand, or to produce gender confusion on the other?
Yeah, I think, in house, in a child's environment, a lot of things can go wrong or go right. And excuse me. But one of the things is that men play an important role, not only in the development of young boys, but also in the development of young girls. And there's a reason why we have mothers and fathers, and they all play significant roles in helping children properly develop. And I think it's important for parents to be mindful of what the kids see when they're at a young age and what kind of discussions they hear, because they're like a little sponge in a young age. If we're having discussions with young people when they're 2, 3, 4, 5 years old about transgenderism, if we're showing those things on the telly and showing shows about this, or if we have magazines, if this is part of the culture within the home, you're going to more likely develop a child who's going to act out as a transgender child. So I think healthy psychology and a healthy home environment does not deal with this as though it actually happens. We want to instruct our children in the fact that nobody ever changes gender. We know that biologically can't happen. And so that's why the home is important, why the environment's important. And that's why many of the children who I see or that grow up into adults had a childhood that was fractured, that was unpleasant, that something happened. So what we do is try to, and this is the word that I always use when I work with them, is tell me what happened that caused you to not like who you are. Because see, that's the big question. Tell me what happened that caused you to not like who you are. And that, if that question is asked, and then I ask the second question, what is it that made you believe that you could actually change from one gender to the other? And then why do you think it's better to be a different gender than who you really are? So those are key questions that bring out a lot of good answers. Obviously, a child or an adult who's going through this on the front side will resist telling anybody this information because they're afraid if they disclose any information, it would disqualify them from getting the hormones and from transitioning. When they fail and realize they have regret and that it wasn't the proper thing for them to do, they're quite open to disclosing that, boy, it was a mistake. I had something happen in my childhood. I didn't want to tell people. And so they're reluctant to tell about abuse. I've had guys tell me about their sexual abuse in their 40s, but they had already transitioned and they were afraid to talk about it, afraid that the therapist wouldn't give them the hormones and wouldn't transition them.
Well, there's a couple of questions that have come up very urgently. Can you please differentiate between gender and sex for me?
Well, yeah, this is always the big argument. Gender and sex are inseparable. Gender and sex, gender is certainly fixed as your sex is fixed. You have a body that's constructed either as a male or a female, and that is your gender sex. So this argument about separating the two is where they think, and they use the term, this is so important, they use the term assigned at birth. Well, nothing is assigned at birth because they use that terminology assigned at birth so that they can say, well, then you can unassign it after birth. So we got to be real careful about the language that they use to promote this ideology. Gender sex are the same. They're fixed. You have a male body or a female body, and you don't have anything in between. You may be intersex. That's a whole different, that is a whole different thing. Intersex people are not ever transgender. They may have some need for surgery to repair their intersex condition, but that is entirely different and separate from people who identify as transgender, and that's why they have separated them out and called them intersex.
Thank you, David.
Yes, Walt, in regard to your own personal choice to detransition, did you experience any opposition, like from the medical people that you went to for assistance?
Yeah, the first one was my therapist at Stanford University in California, who had been guiding people into the surgery, and that therapist said, "Walt, I went to the therapist at 8 years and said, this is really not working. This is just, I still have issues. I just don't think this is the proper thing to do to a body and to destroy me in this way." And the therapist told me, he said, "Just give it time. You'll be fine. You look beautiful as a woman. You're perfectly fine." All the affirmation. And so I said, "Well, okay, well, how long do you have to give it before it works?" And of course, they can't answer that question. And that's why we see the detransitioners typically fall into a category of sometime 5 years post-surgery to 20 years post-surgery. I've had some cases at 30 years where they're detransitioning 30 years after, but the vast majority of them will fall into 5 to 20 years where they regret it. So yeah, they will try to discourage anyone. They don't want, and by the way, this is really important. Of the hundreds of thousands of people that I've worked with, including myself, not one of us, not one, none, have ever been counted among the regretters or detransitioners in the research study the LGBT does. We do not exist. They don't want our numbers to get out there. So I don't know of one person, including myself. We're just this sort of island of people who have found our way back, have found the truth. And the other side, the advocates, are fearful that their clinics are going to get shut down, just like they did in 1979 when they closed them throughout the United States because they said they were ineffective. And by the way, Dr. Charles L. Ihlenfeld, who was a homosexual activist, worked at the Harry Benjamin Gender Clinic in New York, who worked there for 6 years, had administered hormone therapy to 500 men who had gone through the sex change surgery, and he was helping them with the hormone therapy after surgery, had spoken to all 500 of them because he actually personally worked with them during that 6-year period of time. Came out in 1979 in Tappan, New York, to therapists in New York saying, we've got to stop this practice of giving hormones to these people because it's causing too much unhappiness. That's a quote. Too much unhappiness. The second quote is, and too many of them end in suicides. That was a doctor who was performing the hormone therapy for 6 years to 500 people. He said at that group that day that I'm going into psychiatry so that I can look for the deeper underlying issues and actually help these individuals find their way back to who they really are. So that was Dr. Charles L. Ihlenfeld. He wrote, there was an article about it, The Dangers of Hormones. That was 1979. Now the left wants to squash all that. Again, Walt isn't saying that. Was a homosexual endocrinologist who worked with 500 transgenders, said hormones are dangerous and it causes people to commit suicide.
And Walt, are you experiencing any shutdown by social media? And how bad is that problem in the United States?
Yeah. And I love to be shut down because the more they shut me down, my books just skyrocket out the window. So please shut me down all you want because my book sales jump up about 20-fold. So hooray for being shut down. Shut me down, please.
Okay, David, look, well, thank you very much. We've got so many questions. Would you accept the questions to be emailed to you and I can let the people know what the answers they are that you recommend? And if you wouldn't mind, so we'll do that, if that's okay. Yes. By you.
Yeah, sex change regret, I think is...
All right, well, I'll let the people know that have asked the questions. Walt, if you don't mind, David, would you like to close in a quick prayer for us on this vital issue that confronts each and every one of us? Okay.
Yes, Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity we've had tonight to hear from Senator Claire Chandler and from Walt there in the United States. And we thank you for the bravery of both of these individuals, their willingness to stand up in the public arena and to address this incredibly difficult matter. So strengthen them, we pray, and strengthen all of us that we may be firm in our resolve to protect children from harm and to change our culture to stem this tide of madness that seems to have enveloped us. So be with us all, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, David. Our next speaker will be Reverend Phil Ashley from the American Anglican Council, who's going to talk to us about the impact of the Biden administration in terms of the church. So I want to thank everybody for being here tonight, in particular Claire Chandler and, of course, Walt. You are magnificent. There are a lot of people that will agree with what we're saying. A lot of people won't agree. But I think we're starting to make some real inroads into what an issue that has really been an ideological issue rather than a practical issue. So, look, thank you very much for your time, Walt. Thank you, David. And on behalf of the Family Voice Governing Board, I want to thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. The webinar will be available on our YouTube in about a week's time. And again, once again, thank you. And I'd like to say good evening to each and every one of you.
Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter.